Bene, buongiorno. Buongiorno a tutte e a tutti, benvenuti a questo appuntamento con la Mosse Lecture. Welcome everybody, good morning. And we are even presenting this morning the appointment of the Global Mosse Lecture here in this building of the Rectorate of Sapienza. And it is with great pleasure that I open the proceeding of this important event on behalf of Sapienza University of Rome and its rector, Professoressa Antonella Polimeni, which is giving also his support without presence, but with the strongly support the initiative of this morning. To be part of the journey, we have the possibility to say that it's the first time that Rome is hosting the Mosse Lecture, which is following a long and prestigious line of different cities and places around the world: Amsterdam, Berkeley, Charleston, Columbia, Cornell, Lesley, Tokyo, Vienna, Wisconsin, and for this year we are here in Rome. So this is, first of all, a great pleasure, a good opportunity for all of us to be here. And even this small paper that you can collect at the entrance with the small picture of this great city around the world, we have a place there between Ithaca and Jerusalem, which is a nice place, and that's it for us. And for me personal, now it's my point, and it's a very prestigious and great opportunity to open this event with the possibility to introduce in the first part of the speech some of the partner and proponent of the initiative, and then we will listen into the lecture after that. As a first welcome, I will give the floor to Maria Cristina Marchetti, which is la direttrice del Dipartimento di Scienze Politiche. And I'll give you the floor in Italian or in English, I don't know, but, well, please welcome.
Okay, thank you, Umberto. Dear colleagues, guests, and students, as Director of the Department of Political Science, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to Sapienza for the inaugural conference of the Global Mosse Lecture Series. This event, focusing on the disputed memory of anti-Fascism in Italy from 1945 to 2025, represents a significant milestone for our department. It marks a bridge between our historical roots and our future as a center of international research. Our department boasts a long and rigorous tradition in the study of political history and the roots of totalitarianism. We are the heirs to a school of thought that saw Renzo De Felice as its leading figure. His monumental work not only redefined the study of Italian fascism, but established this department as a global reference point. Today we are glad to welcome Professor Renato Moro, a scholar who has contributed to our understanding of contemporary history and the evolution of political memory. It is a privilege to host this seminar in collaboration with the George Mosse Program in History. The intellectual dialogue between the De Felice School and the Mosse legacy is one of the most fruitful in modern historiography. George Mosse's groundbreaking research on the cultural and symbolic dimensions of politics perfectly complements our department's focus on the intersection of political institutions, social movements, and collective actions. As a sociologist, I can say that the nationalization of the masses is a reference point for my discipline too. The theme of today's lecture, The Memory of Anti-Fascism, is particularly timely as we navigate the complexities of 2025 and 2026. Understanding how the past is remembered, contested, and reshaped is essential for any scholar in political discipline. I would like to thank my colleague Donatello Aramini for his work in organizing this edition of the lecture. And I also thank Umberto Gentiloni and most of all Skye Doney for being here today. I wish you all a fruitful discussion and a wonderful stay in Sapienza.
Thank you very much. A few more words on the lecture that was launched in 1997 in Berlin, the first time, with lecturing by George Mosse itself. And then for years, this lecture have involved some of the leading universities in Europe and the United States. I just mentioned some names before, and as well as most of the prominent figure in Western cultural debate. That's why, for us, it's a very important day, I would say. And before giving the floor to our guest, which flew after a storm 2 days ago from the US, there is also another thing which I think is quite interesting and important, that in this opportunity we have, well, the university that is hosting the meeting, different departments which are supporting somehow. I see also other directors here, and I see most of the historians which are, studying this different subject, different generation as well, which is a good point, and together with student, Ph.D. and non-Ph.D. student, graduate and postgraduate student, which is an opportunity even to have a sense of this meeting, which is not only debating a so important historian, but is also debating theme and problem which are nowadays dealing with the role of the historian in the society. Well, I don't want to speak too much. I give with great pleasure the floor to Skye Doney, which is the director of the George Mosse program in history. Please, thank you.
It is true that the weather in Rome is far superior to that of Madison right now. So it was a trip I was happy to make. Dear distinguished guests, dear friends, as Umberto said, my name is Skye Doney. I'm the director of the George L. Mosse program in history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm also the co-director of the Global Mosse Lecture Series, and I greet you on behalf of my leadership. I have co-leadership of the lecture series, Roger and Hans Strauch, who are the devoted co-trustees of the Mosse Foundation. Together, we welcome you to this inaugural Rome Mosse Lecture with Professor Renato Moro. The Mosse Lectures seek to confront daunting contemporary socioeconomic, geopolitical, and environmental challenges by creating opportunities such as this for the development and free exchange of fresh ideas. They aim to popularize new and creative approaches to the most pressing problems of our time. This includes, but is not limited to, the reemergence of authoritarian forms of government, the challenges associated with rapid technological change, climate change, political polarization, and socioeconomic inequality. The spirit of these lectures is firmly rooted in the Mosse family tradition. In the late 19th century, Rudolf Mosse, who was George Mosse's grandfather, established an international publishing and advertising empire in Berlin, and his family used that to aggressively oppose the rise of Nazism. As a result, the Nazi regime targeted the Mosse family, expropriated their property, and forced them into exile. But their commitment to free and open public dialogue did not waver. Family heirs have since continued to advocate for research. They've advocated for experimentation and promoted creative expressions in all forms for the purpose of generating new knowledge about the human experience and public education. The Mosse Lectures continue Rudolph and Emilia Mosse's dedication to philanthropy, in other words. Currently, these events take place on many campuses in North America and in Europe, with recent events having concluded in Tokyo, Vienna, Berlin, and beyond. And there will be another one on Monday on Zoom. If you want to tune in, there's a QR code out in the foyer. Today we're going to focus on anti-fascism, which is absolutely a theme of our time, and one that speaks directly to the vision of the Mosse Lectures for facilitating conversations on challenging issues we now confront. Many of you are most familiar with George L. Mosse, and know then that Rome is an ideal place for an event like a Mosse Lecture that would interrogate the legacies of fascism. George Mosse himself traveled frequently to Rome and to Italy in general. He was good friends with Renzo De Felice and Emilio Gentile. In fact, while he was in exile, Mosse visited Rome with his mother Felicia in 1936. At the time, he was 17 years old, but he later wrote that this experience in Rome set the foundation for his later writings about fascism. It was in Rome, he said, that he first observed how fascism could appeal to individuals, quote, through institutionalizing their desires and their urge for action in political symbols and in new liturgies. The appreciation Mosse had for Rome and for Italy was mutual. Quoting from Emilio Gentile, Lorenzo Benedusi, and Giorgio Caravali wrote in George L. Mosse's Italy, quote, Mosse has been one of the most widely read and best-known historians in the world, and Italy probably has been the country that most profoundly expressed to him its appreciation. In 1995, the University of Camarino awarded Mosse an honorary doctorate, not just for his scholarship, but as Luciano Zani wrote, because Mosse's work, quote, represents a particularly emblematic example of the contribution to civic awareness that historical knowledge can make by getting people to become more conscious of the reality in which they live. If you have an opportunity at the lunch, you could ask Professor Moro about the Camarino experience and the drive from Rome to Camarino with Mosse. It's worth hearing. But Zani here identified one of the qualities that has made Mosse's work enduring, his eye for the historical origins of contemporary challenges, or what Renato Moro has called Mosse's, quote, past, which we must come to terms with in order to draw nearer to a better future. There's a lot more that I would like to say about Mosse and the Mosse family and Italy, and there's been a lot that's been written. But suffice to say that Mosse deeply admired Italy, so much so that in 1979, he told his students in Wisconsin, quote, the Italians are so admirable, the most admirable people in the world, because they can live without government. Perhaps especially some recent iterations. Mosse ended his inaugural Berlin Mosse Lectures in 1997 by posing a challenge to his listener. Quote, since the history of the Mosse family and its noble vision of liberalism are before us, we must not despair, but rather we must try to bring the political reality closer to this ideal through our actions and through our knowledge of history. This remains our charge. We must learn from one another, we must collaborate, and together work toward an improved world and an improved society. Together, we will get to learn from Professor Moro about how we might seek to understand the past to find a better future. I thank him heartily for inaugurating these events and for carrying on even after the accident. Thank you to Sapienza University for hosting, especially to our friends in the Department of Political Sciences, with which the Mosse Lectures signed the agreement for this year. Thank you to Umberto. Thank you to Maria Cristina Marchetti. And thank you again to the Rome Mosse Lecture Scientific and Organizing Committee, Professors Donatello Aramini, Laura Ciglioni, Paolo Acanfora, and Alessandra Tarchini here. And the Mosse Lectures is excited to have additional members, Professors Giovanni Mario Cecchi, Lorenzo Benedusi, and Giorgio Caravali, join from Roma Tre for next year as co-organizers. On behalf of the Global Mosse Lectures series, I am thrilled to continue this productive collaboration between the Mosses and Italy. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Skye, for your word, but thank you for giving us the opportunity to host this appointment or even to meet this important journey for the Mosse lecture. A few words on the speaker, Renato. I know that it's not everybody knows Renato Moro in this room, but it's probably necessary to introduce. I would choose some in your biography, just some few lines. He's Emeritus Professor of Contemporary History at Roma Tre University. I would not translate the number, of course. He's President of Civitas, Forum for Archive and Research on Christian Democracy, and of the national edition of Aldo Moro works. What else? Many books. I would just mention some of them related to part of the topic, la formazione della classe dirigente cattolica, the education of the Catholic ruling class, the church and the extermination of the Jew. First book was 79, the second one is 2002, translated into Spanish, and some of the recent book, L'immagine del nemico, The Image of Enemy, 2009, Una vita, un paese, Aldo Moro e l'Italia nel Novecento, A Live Country in the 20th Century, The Myth of the Catholic Italy, and this book which I found very fascinating and interesting, Storia di una maestra del Sud, che fu la madre di Aldo Moro, the story of the Southern teacher who was Aldo Moro's mother, and last but not least, maybe for even the importance of this morning, he's currently working on a book on the topic he will discuss with us today, this morning. And the topic is, as you all know, A Disputed Resistance, the Memory of Anti-Fascism Italy, 1945-2025. Thank you very much, Renato. You have the floor. Bye.
Well, first of all, my warmest thanks to Skye, Doney, the Mosse program in history, and to the Italian promoters of these events. Well, let's begin. Historian J. Winter notes that producing history and remembrance both try to find meaning in the past. Well, after 1945, this was hard. Winning the war against Hitler or Japan seemed meaningful. Breaking through the German lines at Leningrad seemed meaningful. But events like Hiroshima or Auschwitz, in their nihilism, challenged whether the past could have meaning at all. And this is why anti-fascism and resistance became the key narratives that gave meaning to European history. To present themselves as innocent, European countries shifted the blame for the war entirely onto Germany. As Tony Judd observed, they did this by claiming that an overwhelming majority of their populations resisted. Nations such as France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia leaned on the Smith. And meanwhile, left-wing cultures in Europe even idealized the Red Army and communist partisans as essential agents in the victory. However, these claims obscured several less comfortable realities. Most occupied Europeans either collaborated with the occupiers, a minority, or more commonly accepted German forces with resignation. There was also active participation, sometimes, in the deportation of the Jews. Moreover, participation in resistance was a restricted and in some measure self-restricting set of persons, thus building a national sense of victory and liberation on the anti-fascist paradigm, a term coined in Italy in the 1990s, soon encountered obvious difficulties. George Mosse, to whom this lecture is devoted, spent his life analyzing fascism and its threats to individuals and democracy in mass society. Drawing from his insights a reconsideration of the memory of fascism, anti-fascism, and resistance in post-war Italy may yield a more nuanced historical understanding of these critical issues. Italy is not alone in struggling with its complex past. In France and Belgium, for example, conflicts between political groups shaped clashing memories. Rather than one resistance myth, different memories of the Nazi persecution competed publicly. In France, neither de Gaulle nor the communists could control the legacy of the resistance. A non-stop battle over memory began, fueled by the same Vichy syndrome, marked by scandals and insults, as Henri Rousseau noted. In Belgium, the left-right divide and later regional tensions turned some people against the memory of the resistance and even led some to support collaborators. However, even if Italy is not the only country with issues about the resistance's past, few, I think, have a relationship with it as divisive as Italy's is. More than 80 years after Mussolini's regime ended, the resistance remains a major point of contention. Unlike most Western European countries, and more like some Eastern European ones, the Italian resistance was an armed insurrection. Its role in the country's liberation was not decisive, of course, but it was present. The conflict was particularly cruel, amounting to a more radical civil war than in many other places. Because of this, political cultures in Italy have long debated whether the liberation from Nazi fascism is truly unifying and whether there is still a basic distinction between fascism and anti-fascism. These divisions already appeared during the resistance. At first, anti-fascist forces reached compromises to fight. But after the liberation, and especially once the anti-fascist front split, the disagreements deepened into sharp conflicts. There were some common elements in anti-fascist party discourse. This included the emphasis on the popular and unitary character of the insurrection, and the idea of the resistance as a second risorgimento. Both arguments served to affirm, as in the rest of Europe, that the majority of citizens had suffered fascism and never supported it. They also excluded the idea of resistance as a civil war. But beyond these general points, each political culture of the resistance advanced its own view of anti-fascism, sharply contrasting it with the others. This deep divisions were apparent from the beginning. In 1949, Don Primo Mazzolari, one of the few anti-fascist Catholics, criticized that because of the parties, I'm quoting, the resistance had lost its initial nobility, failed to preserve the spiritual heritage of its dead, and built a trench instead of a bridge. Historians have confirmed this view, speaking of a shattered memory, divided and antagonistic images, a narrative in parts, if not in parties. But despite these findings, the main historical debate follows two lines of interpretation, fiercely opposed to each other, but actually agreeing on one point. Both believe that from the end of the war through the 1980s, the anti-fascist paradigm I mentioned, created, mainly by the left, especially the communists, shaped the collective memory by mythologizing the resistance. They agreed that this anti-fascist narrative began between 1945 and 1947, was temporarily weakened during the intense Cold War years, 1948, 1954. But from 1955, and especially in the 1960s with the new center-left government, that is the alliance between Christian Democrats and socialists, became the national norm. This memory of the resistance remained dominant until the late 1970s, when it was challenged first by socialist leader Bettino Craxi in the 1980s, and then by the tycoon Silvio Berlusconi in the 1990s, both with support from right-wing revisionist historians. And here, the two interpretations diverge. Moderate historians criticize the paradigm, the anti-fascist paradigm, as artificial and false, lament its persistence, and hope for its end to bring true national unity to the country. In contrast, left-wing historians defend the ethical and political value of the paradigm, blaming its crisis on right-wing attacks. As noted, it's the idea itself of the anti-fascist paradigm that deserves scrutiny. My lecture will try to review the conflict over the memory of the resistance and anti-fascism in Italy. We'll try to offer a strong reinterpretation of it and to identify its implications for Italian history. First, was the anti-fascist story a united effort already between 1945 and 1947? The answer is no. The first Liberation Day, it was celebrated in Italy on April the 25th, 1946. Even then, it was experienced differently across the main political and cultural areas. There were three distinct and divergent events. In Rome, an institutional celebration featured the highest state authorities. There was an homage to the altar of the fatherland, a mass for the victims, that is, a reconnection with national history, but without any anti-fascist emphasis. In Milan, the partisans associations promoted, no, association one, it it was at the time, promoted a popular festival that exalted the leftist North Wind. Also in Milan, the Christian Democrats gathered their partisans in the archbishopric to celebrate the Catholic nation in the presence of the Cardinal Ildefonso Schuster. These divisions anticipated the fracturing of the Partisans Association itself. Before the breakup of the Unitarian post-war anti-fascist front, and before the expulsion of socialists and communists from the government, a Christian Partisans Association was born. And a deep rift also emerged between the social communists and the partisans linked to the radical Partito d'Azione, the Action Party. And these fractures, beware, never healed. Three distinct partisan associations still exist in Italy. What then explains this early divergence in rituals and organizations that foreshadowed Cold War divisions? We could not attribute it only to irreconcilable disputes among the 6 parties of the National Liberation Committee. A deeper analysis is needed. We have to remember that a significant segment of the country did not identify with the resistance. So the left was not the only factor to be considered. Conservative and moderate sectors of Italy also contributed to the immediate emergence of challenges and constraints. Thus, we must pay attention to the right. Analysts often ignore the issue of the right wing in post-war Italy. Yet, without it, I think that discussions of the Italian political systems are incomplete. While anti-fascists did gradually guide the transition to democracy, they began as a minority. The Christian Democrats dominated the moderate electorate, but moderates still maintained a distinct political culture. And this is a key to understanding how resistance and anti-fascism shaped Italian society. On the right, there was, of course, also the neo-fascist radicalism that would always be frontally opposed to the resistance, and that, it cannot be forgotten, directly inserted not simply the fascist regime, but the social republic itself, that is, its new radical and more violent experience into the post-fascist political struggle, qualifying itself as a party of veterans who wanted to defend the reasons of those who had fought against liberal democracy. Well, in the 1950s, those neo-fascists represented almost the 5% of voters in Italy, something absolutely unique in the West. However, on the right, there was a much larger reality, which has been effectively defined as a passive majority that did not recognize itself either in fascism or in anti-fascism. It was vast and varied. There was the protest of the monarchist, conservative South, where no resistance ever happened, and where the South wind, contrary to the North wind, brought many votes to the anti-political uomo qualunque, the everyman movement. There were the many young formed during fascism and aspiring to leaving it behind in a post-fascist and not anti-fascist age. There was the influential moderate area interpreted by the voices of famous journalists such as Giovanni Ansaldo, Curzio Malaparte, Mario Missiroli, Indro Montanelli, Giovanni Gareschi. You will remember the novels and the movies about Don Camillo and Pepone. or in largely spread illustrated magazines such as Oggi and Gente by the journalist and publisher Edilio Rusconi. And there was a large part of the Italian church, the Vatican hierarchies, the large anti-communist mass organization of Catholic Action led by Luigi Gedda. This area ran counter to the idea that the crisis of the years 1943-1945 represented a radical and irreversible break. It was not nostalgic. It was disappointed by the fascist model, but it did not recognize itself in anti-fascism, and on the contrary, proclaimed that it was necessary to close any enmity among Italians. Of the past of the fascist regime, it recalled the mistakes it made, essentially the alliance with Nazi Germany, and not its anti-democratic political and social principles. So it proposed a sort of immemorial memory, defined as a gray area by historians. It claimed to be a fascist that is not fascist, but ended up being in reality essentially anti-fascist. Basically moved by the fear of communism, this area maintained that insisting on the memory of resistance only served to legitimize the Communist Party. Quantifying the weight of this gray area is difficult. However, it represented, if not half, a very significant part of the country's public opinion. The June 2, 1946 referendum on monarchy and republic was not, of course, entirely a clash over anti-fascism, but it involved it. So it is impossible to include all the 45 and 73% voters who expressed themselves in favor of the monarchy in the anti-fascist front. But it's probable that a portion, between 30 or 40% of them, belonged to it. And this sector of Italians was endowed with a very high political potential. It is true that it never appeared in the first person on the stage. However, it had a profound influence on popular and muscle culture. Oggi, the press organs I just mentioned, was the country's most widely circulated weekly. So the gray zone could exert a very profound influence, both directly and through an intermediary, and in fact it found the vehicle for expressing its requests essentially in Christian democracy. Thus, the very existence of this moderate, conservative Italy burned the possibilities of anti-fascism to propose itself as a shared culture of the entire spectrum of democratic political forces operating in Republican Italy, and at the same time, that of the resistance to be recognized as the founding myth of the new democratic ethos. Let us now look to the left. For the communists, the myth of the resistance, of which the party had been the main protagonist, was probably the central element of their symbolic universe. It justified the party's transformation from a small third internationalist reality, totally dependent on Moscow, into a large national party. The central axis of the communist discourse on the resistance was that of an anti-fascist national unity and the party's rescue of the nation. In the communist vision, and in the first phase also in the socialist one, national perspective and revolutionary demands both went hand in hand and clashed. The popular character of the partisan war was in fact also read as a political programmatic expression of the unity of the working class and the popular classes. The resistance was therefore a unitary and national phenomenon, but at the same time, the real anti-fascist protagonist remained the working class and therefore the Communist Party itself. Hence, the liberation struggle represented only an important battle, but it was part of a much larger and more prolonged war. And for this reason, the resistance attempt to be free could not be said to be over. The socialist position was not substantially different. They too did not renounce the idea of resistance as a people's revolution, even if, given the heterogeneous nature of the party, democratic revolution, national revolution, and proletarian revolution often overlapped even more clearly. Both parties took on the role of the main garrison of anti-fascist and resistance memory, but it was the communist one that superimposed its own memory of the resistance, almost as if communism, anti-fascism, and the resistance were synonymous. Hundreds of sections of the party received the names of those who died in partisan war. The communists characterized the urban landscape of cities and towns in the center north, promoting memorial stones, tombstones, and sculptures dedicated to the partisans. The party actively supported the granting of the gold medal of the resistance to the cities in which an active partisan struggle had taken place. And the party elite itself based its legitimacy on a partisan past. Well, if, according to communists and socialists, the resistance seen as the fundamental moment of the anti-fascist unity of the nation had been negatively interrupted, according to another leftist political culture, that of the ex-azionisti, the former members of the Action Party, things were even worse. Resistance had been betrayed. For them, the partisan war had represented an extraordinary and unrepeatable opportunity for the radical transformation of the country. Fascism had been the result of an ethical collapse in Italian political customs, and consequently, any future transformation would entail a refoundation in moral relation. So the azionisti were aware that the liberation struggle had been an act of rebellion carried out by isolated individuals or by very small groups, and they insisted on the absolute autonomy of the liberation struggle. The azionisti were thus the first to speak of a crisis of the resistance. They individuated the re-emergence of a deep Italy, they called this in this way, the Italy of all time, evident in the continuity of the state, and thus concluded that the resistance had been a betrayed revolution. The accusation moved from a generalized polemic to the domination of the parties and focused, on the one hand, on the conservatism of Christian democracy, and on the other, on the cynical circumspection and totalitarianism of the communists. The only way they saw to change things was resuming the path of the resistance. Now and always resistance, this was the slogan one of them, the jurist Piero Calamandrei, invented, and it became a symbol and was replicated and reproposed countless times. The image of the resistance proposed by the azionisti did not identify with the political party. However, it interpreted both the sentiments of a relevant leftist area and the disappointments and attention-seeking of many resistance veterans. So it had a deep impact on Italian society. Well, only a clear vision of the claims both the right and the left made on anti-fascism and resistance helps to understand the features of the position of the Christian democratic political culture. The Catholic Party gathered a segment of the popular opposition to fascism, but not only and not so much as one of the sectors of historical anti-fascism, rather as the bearer of a more moral than political aversion to fascism, in deep harmony with the process of detachment from the regime matured in large sectors of Italian society. The Christian democratic desire to affirm a non-ideological anti-fascism, therefore, significantly differentiated it from the readings of the resistance elaborated by other center and left-wing forces. Christian Democrats recognized the value of resistance for the foundation of Italian democracy, but repeated and repeated that precisely for this reason it represents a politically concluded phase. This precise delimitation of its value weakened its rupture charge, but at the same time insisted on aspects often diminished by the left. The military dimension of patriots fighting the Germans invader, the role of civil participation. Moreover, in harmony with the Church's desired role of mediation, Christian Democrats called for a work of civil reconciliation they consider indispensable for the construction of the democratic fabric of the country. In the hardest years of the Cold War, first half of the 50s, amid attempts by the left to politically appropriate the resistance, Christian democracy turned the accusations of having interrupted or betrayed it and of being a danger to democratic freedoms against the social communists and the actionists. The outbreak of the Cold War pushed Christian democracy to replace the fascism, anti-fascism dichotomy with a new one, democracy, totalitarianism. Thus, despite the fact that their aims remained very different from those of the neo-fascist right or of the gray zone, the dominated anti-communist perspective led Christian Democrats to a marginalization of the resistance. For the centrist governments led by Christian democracy, April 25, the celebration of resistance and liberation, became a problem much more than a resource. And even if it was not total, oblivion constituted the prevailing trend in government policies aimed through schools, commemoration, mass media at forming the public spirit. However, if in this period the Christian Democrats relegated the resistance to a secondary, uncertain, and contested corner, they did not remove its memory or its function. The anti-rhetoric was head-on opposed to the heroic rhetoric of the left and was fully compatible, even if not superimposable, with the gray memory preferred by the Church, but it also legitimized the new democratic order born of the resistance. In addition to the Christian Democrats, their centrist allies also celebrated the resistance in a dignified but cautious way. The non-progressive liberal democratic lay culture, for example, figures such as the President of the Republic, Luigi Einaudi, the Social Democrat leader, Giuseppe Saragat, the Republican, Ugo La Malfa, held a stance not far from that of Christian democracy, which was moderate, anti-communist, and anti-fascist. Liberals reiterated that anti-fascism could only be provisional and exceptional, having exhausted its historical function with the end of fascism. Republicans strongly recalled the link between resistance and the traditions of democracy and the Risorgimento initiative. Thus, this area played an important role, especially during the hardest phase of the Cold War. Unlike the Christian Democrats surrendering to the gray zone discourse sometimes, Republicans and Social Democrats indicated a third way that would keep anti-fascism and anti-communism united. In doing so, the moderate lay culture represented a reserve for Italian democracy and built the ground on which, after 1960, the Christian Democrats and the Socialists attempted to create a popular and mass myth of the resistance. But was this attempt successful? It is true. Why from 1946 to 1955 the images of the resistance were not only different but deeply contrasting, a new effort was done. But would resistance become a popular mass myth in this new phase? No. We know, for example, that in France, in the second half of the 50s and in the early 60s, a dominant myth of resistentialism minimized the impact of the Civil War and imposed resistance as an object of memory, identifying it with the nation as a whole. Of course, in Italy too, new elements emerged in favor of a greater recognition of the value of the resistance. Nevertheless, the hegemony of the anti-fascist paradigm was never achieved in this new phase. In the second half of the 50s, the left wing of Christian democracy gained a growing role in the party and progressively led the center-left turn. Unlike the center and right of the parties, this component did not consider the resistance closed. Without any nostalgia for the past anti-fascist unity with the communists, left-wing Christian Democrats returned to insist on the resistance as the root of the Constitution, in view of the necessity of advancing toward the achievement of the progressive social goals the Constitutional Charter established. Hence, from 1955, they launched a campaign aimed at regaining control of the resistance, contesting the communist monopoly, and reaffirming the Catholic protagonists' presence in an ethical religious key. The moment of the collaboration with the socialists at the government thus represented a remarkable and perhaps unique effort to popularize and massify the resistance. The initiatives multiplied in schools, radio, TV, broadcasts. Bella Ciao was not the proper resistance song, but thanks to its merits, avoiding a precise political connotation, evoking the victim parameter preferred by Catholics, it experienced extraordinary success and diffusion. In 1965, the celebration of the Resistance's 20th anniversary represented for the first time a national event. It must be reiterated, however, that even in this new phase, there was no attempt to overcome separate and contrasting approaches. On the right, the neo-fascist and the grey anti-fascist memory still remained strong. Christian democracy and the minor center parties continued to insist that no return to a liberation committee-type anti-fascist unity was in question, and gave the renewed resistance celebrations the meaning of a confirmation of the goodness of their social progress line. And the Communist Party did not abandon its own reading in favor of a unitary one. It attacked the new series of celebration, accusing them of being only instrumental and branding them as a beatification of resistance. It even radicalized its own discourse on an interrupted resistance, substantially transforming it into that of revolution betrayed by the Christian democratic surrender to the capitalist classes. It used the reference to what was happening in Vietnam to assimilate in a divisive tone the Italian resistance to the liberation struggle against American imperialism, assimilating the conduct of the United States in Southeast Asia to what the Nazis had done in Europe. Let's come to the 1970s. In Italy, those were the years of Enrico Berlinguer's Communist Party's proposal of an historic compromise among communists, Catholics, socialists. They were the years of the national solidarity, including communists suggested by Aldo Moro's Christian democracy. According to the main interpretations of the story of the anti-fascist paradigm, a shared memory of the resistance dominated this phase. May this be confirmed? Unfortunately, not even this. Between the 60s and the 70s, a new variant of the actionist myth of the betrayed resistance emerged, this time in the culture of the New Left. It fused post-actionist moods with rigid Marxist-Leninist matrices. The student protest equated fascism and democracy. Clearly opposed to the traditional vision of anti-fascism, it considered the social communist anti-fascism as an integral part of that system against which it was fighting. The resistance, of course, was still needed, but it had to be new, red, and openly revolutionary. And after the start of the strategy of tension, the long series of attacks and killings of the years of lead in Italy, the new militant anti-fascist of the protest movement was loaded with revolutionary, subversive, and violent demands. The slogan, "Now and always resistance," was taken up and became an inevitable element of the demonstration. And another child of the culture of protest, Marco Pannella's Radical Party, also joined the contestation of the tradition of resistance values. In his biting anti-party polemic, its leader did not hesitate to invest some of the symbols of the partisan struggle, such as the massacre of Via Rasella in Rome. In short, the novelty introduced by the new left's political culture brought a pessimistic and anti-party narrative of the Republic origins that would have a non-secondary influence on an entire generation of intellectuals, further preventing a shared image of the resistance. In any case, even in the face of the new left's contestation, the different perspective of the main parties on anti-fascism and resistance continued to collide and contrast. The Communist Party asked for the end of the Christian Democrat centrality and the return to the united model represented by the CLN, the Liberation Committee. But Christian Democrats continued to use the reference to anti-fascism and resistance not as a shared element, but as a reminder to reaffirm their difference and distance from the extreme wings of the political spectrum, the opposite extremisms, as they called them, and therefore as the basis of their central role. Particularly emblematic of the lack of any shared memory of the resistance was what happened on the occasion of the 30th anniversary, April 25, 1975. The communists opposed the initiative of the President of the Republic, the Christian Democratic Giovanni Leone, to celebrate the anniversary in the United Chambers. The reason was that it would have necessarily involved the presence of the representatives of the neo-fascist party. The ceremony was scaled down, invitation only, but Ferruccio Parri, the 1945 Prime Minister of the Liberation, a symbol of the partisan North Wind, controversially announced his absence. Faced with the insistent communist unitary pressure, Christian democracy publicly announced that it would have celebrated the Liberation Day on its own, and it chose to do so in Cassino, its own solid fifth dome, in the center of southern Latium, where the Anglo-American contribution to the defeat of fascism was evident. The role of the Italian small military forces was present, and the need for national pacification was particularly felt. On the Liberation Day, right and left-wing extremists brawled in the squares. Christian Democrat exponents were contested, prevented from speaking. Events in memory of the resistance organized by their youth organization were disturbed. And both the secretary of the Christian Democratic Party, Amintore Fanfani, and the foreign minister, Aldo Moro, the two often considered an alternative one to the other, proclaimed that the spirit of the resistance and the common anti-fascist commitment of Christian Democrats had nothing to do with the problems of governments and majorities, which responded to other needs. Well, on April 25, 1978, in the context of the Moros' kidnapping by the Red Brigades, a large mass joint demonstration actually took place, and it saw the left-wing parties and the Christian Democrats mobilized side by side in the call to the resistance and in the fight against terrorism. But this was a unique event, an exception, an exception explained by the special context of those days. Less than 2 months after the tragic conclusion of the kidnapping of Moro on July 8, 1978, a man of the resistance, the socialist Sandro Pertini, was elected president of the Republic, and it was the highest institutional recognition given to the resistance up to that moment. However, not even this time this meant that the hegemonic narrative of anti-fascism was now being confirmed. The Pertini presidency promoted a centrality of the reference to the values of the resistance, but it did so in a key already tinged with an accentuated anti-institutional and sometimes anti-party polemic, which, even from a new point of view, would end up questioning the centrality of the political culture of resistance itself. As for the final crisis of the anti-fascist paradigm, the two main interpretations of the story you have mentioned see a deep continuity between the 1980s and the 1990s, and blame or praise, depending on the perspective, Craxi and Berlusconi for their responsibility in it. On the contrary, the two phases and the connected responsibilities, or merits, if you want, seem sharply different. The climate of the 80s was not yet anti-fascist. Rather, it was characterized by a culture describable as post-anti-fascism. At the beginning of 1982, an exhibition on the 1930s art opened in Milan. It was a huge surprise. As one of the main Italian newspapers wrote, the public was shouldering, elbowing on a very cold and hostile evening to give the assault on the exhibition. It was in this context that Bettino Craxi, the new leader of the Socialist Party, opened a lively, competitive controversy with the communists and sparked a new debate on anti-fascism. Its lasting or not meaning, its limits. The growing awareness of anti-fascism's role in legitimizing communism made its myth begin to stumble. The 40th anniversary of the resistance, April 1985, was preceded and followed by repeated polemical interventions by the socialists, who strongly condemned the communists' assumption of the role of defenders of democracy in the name of the resistance unity. Socialists denounced the fact that behind the communist identification of anti-fascism with democracy, there was a misunderstanding. Certainly, democracy was anti-fascist, but the opposite, that is, that anti-fascism was always democratic, was not true. Therefore, its limits were undeniable, and the unique embrace that came from the resistance and then from anti-fascist sentiment led to making prevail the similarities, sometimes tenuous, of the political forces to their differences, often profound. As you can see, those polemical themes were not anti-fascist. In the majority of the polemics that aroused so many scandalized reactions, the value of anti-fascism itself and of the resistance remained as a sure reference. Socialists simply wanted to contest the political use of anti-fascism made by the communists and ask whether, given the many changes that had taken place, the concept of the constitutional arc of political forces identified only with anti-fascism could be overcome. And it was, on the contrary, it was the political earthquake that occurred in Italy between 1989 and 1994, with the collapse of the entire political system that radically transformed the meaning of all these issues, turning them once again into an incandescent political cauldron. There was, first of all, a cultural shift. The relationship between the memory of the resistance and that of the Shoah changed profoundly. While the latter gained particular visibility, the former suffered an evident loss of meaning and relevance. In short, the Holocaust tended to potentially replace the resistance in collective memory. Secondly, with the end of the Cold War, the national political context changed dramatically. The political center collapsed. Right and left-wing oppositions re-emerged. The conventio ad excludendum, the Latin term used in Italy to define a convention to exclude both anti-system forces, communists and neo-fascists, ended. Consequently, traditional delegitimation in terms of anti-communism and anti-fascism weakened. Finally, scandals related to the corruption of the main parties exploded. So none of the parties that had been part of the resistance survived. Christian Democrats, Socialists, Republicans, Social Democrats, Liberals, all substantially wiped out. The Communist Party transformed itself into a Democratic Party of the Left, abandoning with the name all its former Marxist and Leninist implication. And on the opposite front, the neo-fascist Italian social movement transformed itself into a national alliance, aspiring to overcome the dispute between fascism and anti-fascism. As to the new political forces in affirmation, Umberto Bosse's Northern League, and Forza Italia, Forward Italy, the personal party fielded by Berlusconi for the 1994 elections, they had no connection with the past. The center-right coalition around Berlusconi was entitled the Pole of Freedom. Berlusconi himself professed a liberal identity. But this new culture did not draw on the ideas of Benedetto Croce or Luigi Einaudi. Its tutelary deities were the voices of the grey Italy of the past, Montanelli, Guareschi, Longanesi, Rusconi. And from that culture, Berlusconi took up the criticism of the parties, the radical anti-communism that included openness to neo-fascism, a minimizing, if not nostalgic, memory of fascism, the devaluation of the resistance and vice versa, the centrality of the fratricidal war, the request for a national reconciliation based on the recognition of the equal dignity between fighters of Salò and the partisans, the refusal to accept April 25 as the central date of the civil republican calendar. Some attempts to establish a sort of peacemaking between fascism and anti-fascism followed. They were pursued by the left-wing president of the Chamber of Deputies, Luciano Violante, and then by the new president of the Republican, Carlo Azeglio Sampi. But not only they did not succeed, but they also provoked new and furious controversies, mirroring and eternalizing and generalizing vision of a fascism, a primal, eternal, fundamental form of fascism. Umberto Eco's idea, fascism engraved in anthropology and history, the left developed an eternalizing and generalizing vision of an anti-fascism, original and unique, in a sort of eternal friend-enemy scheme, which finds its legitimacy precisely in claiming for itself the same characteristics, originality and uniqueness attributed to the enemy. The electoral victory in September 2022, a month after the 100th anniversary of the March on Rome, of a party like Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, has in some way represented the final victory of a long anti-fascist political tradition. We are at the end of this long itinerary. What do the elements we have seen emerge suggest for a final appraisal? First of all, it is evident that both of the two simplifying images we started with must be corrected. The long accredited thesis that sees a common resistance image celebrated by victorious anti-fascism based on a basic narrative shared by the individual components of the anti-fascist front and imposed as the dominant narrative to the country must be substantially reformulated. No less evident is that this narrative was never hegemonic because it was not a single but a multiple image. Hence, the hypothesis of opposing only two great memories, one on the right and one on the left, does not even hold up. In the case of a red versus a black memory, this would be the communists a strength they probably did not have, and the neo-fascists a role greater than their actual size and cultural weight. In the case of a Christian democratic conservative versus a communist progressive memory, this would risk undervaluing the center, the democratic, liberal, and non-communist left, the difference among Catholics, and above all, the gray area. Indeed, one wonders whether the thesis of hegemonic anti-fascist paradigm wounded by the conservative right takes for granted a polemical affirmation that has always come from the conservative right itself. That is, the contestation on an effective hegemony of the mythologized truth about the resistance imposed by the anti-fascist parties. Everything that has been constructed so far contradicts it, or at least resizes it in such terms as to make this argument to be revised and articulated differently. A second consideration concerns the chronological order of events. As we have seen, a progressive and very rapid widening of the distance between the various positions of the political forces began already in 1946 and would never really heal. Furthermore, since 1945, an anti-fascist position, that of the gray zone, was relevant at the level of popular mass communication. It is true that starting in 1960, as we have seen, the culture of the center-left tried to bring those opposing models closer together and to give life to a common resistance mythology in a national key, and that this great attempt continued in some ways in the 70s in the climate of the encounter between constitutional forces, but it's equally undeniable that this perspective never managed to establish itself as hegemonic. It continued to be challenged by very powerful enemies. An evident symptom of all this is the substantial weakness of a civic religion based on resistance. And a second symptom is the deeply divergent images of the resistance, also, and probably the most widespread of the media, that is cinema, in the movies too, if you look at them. The gray memory, the Catholic one, the social communist, and that of the new left have often, if you say always, often been polemically opposed. In short, the resistance has always been disputed and never represented a unifying element. The reality of the gray zone needs to be taken into particular serious consideration. We have seen that even after the end of the tragic fascist experience, about a third of Italians did not accept the anti-fascist values and wished to overcome both fascism and anti-fascism. At first glance, this seems unbelievable. Concludis' 1979 essay Toward the General Theory of Fascism, George Mosse, insisted on the fact that the fragments of the Western cultural and ideological past which fascism used for its own purposes were still lying ready to be formed into a new synthesis, although in a different way. This explains, according to me, the presence and the strength of this area. And so the Italian case brings to the surface a fundamental but often hidden element of post-war European and probably not only European history. As Christoph Cornelissen noted recently, anti-fascism had already lost its cohesive power by 1945-1946, and the lofty hope that politics would be fundamentally renewed in the spirit of the resistance was dashed against the reality of established political structures. So the existence of the gray area shows that the anti-fascism that established itself in the 1990s cannot be considered an absolute novelty. It can even be hypothesized that the earthquake of 1994 meant not the affirmation of a new political culture, but the return to the foreground, and now in a directly political role, of the entire culture of anti-fascism, sedimented in 4 decades of national life. If during the Cold War the culture of the gray zone had not been a direct protagonist of the politics of the Republic after 1994, much of its content, values, symbols, exponents returned to express themselves. It remains to be seen what the consequences of this conflictual, unresolved situation are for the collective identity of Italians. Let us beware in the first place of any moralistic slippage. I never believed in shared memory. In a democracy, the juxtaposition of different images of the past is in some way physiological. In a certain sense, it is even positive and enriching. Positive because it allows people to express sensations, aspirations, feelings, which are widespread in the different sectors of a society. Enriching because, as we have seen, almost each of the different declinations in conflict has given voice to aspects that are not invented or artificial, but however exclusive and absolutized, are real of that past, favoring its collective rooting. But in our case, it is evidence that confronting different images was rarely constructive. Rather, it led to a new and destructive civil war, even if this time ideological. A second warning must be made. What we have examined must not lead to a pessimistic interpretation of the story of the Italian post-war republic, as if it were in substance a wrong history. Are we facing a bankruptcy scenario? This does not seem sustainable either. Too often, in their interpretations of post-war Italy, historians have been dominated by the temptation to make the history of something that should or could have been, and that was not, rather of that something more modest but real, which in fact it was. In short, the potential and limits of Italian society must be adequately taken into account. Certainly, the weight of an a-fascist, enough, if not anti-fascist Italy was substantial, but there was also a civil society that, if not properly in accordance with the National Liberation Committee formula, recognized itself in a broad, pre-political anti-fascism. The very role of the parties has profoundly contradictory aspects. They contributed to forming strong partisan identities in the country and deep-rooted feelings of party belonging, which overwhelmed the feeling of common belonging, but they also contributed to re-establishing democratic citizenship. So, despite a profoundly disputed resistance, it cannot be denied that precisely through the great political cultures, the resistance actually entered the collective Italian identity of Italians. The evidence is in the fact that on several occasions, the common anchorage to anti-fascism and resistance has shown a significant ability to help the country to resist even violent tears, such as those coming from the ideological clash of the Cold War and then from the terrorism of the years of lead. So even though particularized, the memory of the resistance has been present and influential among Italians. The problem is to assess what consequences and what prices this particization brought. A first prize was certainly the continuing difficulty in nationalization. The first prize thing, it is this. In Italy, the disputes on the national past are particularly alive, beginning with the Risorgimento, continuing with fascism, and ending with the so-called Republic of Parties. Well, the political use of the resistance also had a decisive effect, limiting its ability to embrace the experience of an entire people and to effectively become part of a strong identity and a widespread memory. The case of the recourse to the idea of resistance as the second risorgimento is emblematic in this way. Not only this widely accepted definition, easy, evocative of national continuity, was scientifically very impressive, but it was also politically ambivalent, completion or resumption of the risorgimento, past or future, order or revolution. Moreover, the idea of a second risorgimento brought with it all the difficulties the country has always had and still has in dealing with the memory of national unification. So many historians have identified a still weak and unbalanced national identity as a long-term structural element of Italian history, and this analysis of the political use of the resistance fully confirms this as an element at the root of many of the country's difficulty. Second and last prize, the wear and tear of the very values of anti-fascism that all this politicization has entailed. Anti-fascism is one of the most powerful political cultures of the 20th century, and despite its possible distortions, it preserves values and meaning. But today, anti-fascism is not living an easy life at the global level. It has become a taboo for the right and a polemic weapon for the left, a shortcut to political insufficiencies. While an anti-fascist song, the Bella Ciao I mentioned, can still be invoked by protesters all over the world as a message for freedom from oppression, while heterogeneous far-left groups reclaim their anti-fa identity, the more and more dominating worldwide right-wing culture considers anti-fascism as something old, outdated, and puts it and fascism at the same negative level, and suggests to overcome both. Some voices go as far as to judge anti-fascism as today's authoritarianism. Nevertheless, the very anti-fascism, the resistance experienced, radically different from present radicalization, continues to be helpful for democracy today, I think. It was a broad anti-fascism, an anti-fascism that simply identified itself with democratic institutions and was felt as the conquest of freedom and independence for all Italians, including the fascists. And this, I think, undoubtedly retains its value. But how much of this value has been put into practice in the story we have told? Very little. But this is the very reason why this story had to be told. Thank you for your attention.
Bene, thank you very much. Really, grazie al Professor Moro for this great contribution. Long path in Italian history, but also related with some point of interpretation at the end, which are not only related with part of our history, but more general, I would say, in the methodology and the way of studying the past and dealing with sources, many of the problems that we are dealing every day. So thank you really much. I think has been a very good starting point for Mosse lecture in Rome, and I hope it will be also a point to continue this project with the legacy of dealing with some of the points related with your lecture, and of course all of us are curious about the book or what is going to be published related to that. Well, there is also time for, I would say, for some question, why not, some point which can be raised in the room before lunch. if there are any. Please, prego, presentatevi anche col nome, grazie.
Is it working?
Yes.
Ooh, nice. Anyway, I'm a student here in Sapienza, and we've talked, there is this very interesting conference about the memory of anti-fascism in politics, in today's parties as well, and about the Italian society having its limits. But I feel we have overlooked a little the place where institutionalized memory is firstly taught, which is schools. And I'm talking middle schools or high schools. I'm interested in teaching. I've been in school myself until a few years ago, and there's something Mr. Doney said in his introduction that made me think deeply about what is being taught in Italian schools right now. Mosse observed after traveling to Italy that fascism appealed through institutionalizing the societal urge for action, because fascism is action as much as resistance, and anti-fascism are. However, in today's school, partially due to that very misunderstood category, which is totalitarianism, I'm sorry, it seems as if fascism was the complete lack of action, equal to surrendering every urge to move towards anything, every desire to shape reality, every effort to do anything. Fascism is almost presented as the answer to a society that wanted to turn off, when the real society it was born in was actually the opposite. I hope I'm making myself clear. Today's society, however, actually exhibits this need. Abstentionism is increasing in all Europe, and the students, also thanks to social media, are continually surrounded by things they are reminded they have no control on, no power on. Many students don't want to act, they don't want to be part of politics someday, they don't want to choose. Our teachers, I'm talking again, middle school teachers or high school teachers, they always told us fascism was the easy way and anti-fascism the hard one, but right one. So being fascist was easy, being in the resistance was hard, but it was right, which is what we try to teach children in school. Very simplistic, but adequate to an 11 years old, maybe, I don't know. Now, is it possible that the collective memory of fascism is changing and being distorted to protect this concept? Paradoxically, trying to keep fascism somewhat appealing to students so that they understand it the simplistic way we want them to, and the resistance is still the hard but right one. So acting is difficult, but it's what we gotta do. Or is it maybe part of that devaluation of resistance you mentioned? I don't know. I hope I made myself clear, and thank you. Thank you very much.
Grazie, sì, I think so. Others? Altri? Others? Please.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. I'm curious, I have two questions. The different memories that you traced, some of them were very apologetic about what the people did or did not do during fascism. Some were still very antagonistic of we need to continue the fight of anti-fascism. Others said let's forget, oblivion of memory. And I'm wondering if you have any cases of genuine contrition, saying we were fascists, it was wrong, that's how we will move on. I can't think of very many, and I would think that it's very politically, not very politically useful. But I think that's an important aspect. The other question relates to anti-fascism, anti-fascism. There's a lot of a lot of opposition in what's determining memory, identity. And I wonder if there's a kind of larger bankruptcy of ideology, where all of the words we're using are very old terms. And fascism was more than 80 years ago. The word communism, liberalism, all of these are old terms. And I'm wondering if, in place of looking for new categories, you say one of the main arguments is we should overcome anti-fascism, anti-fascism. That is a political position in and of itself. And I'm wondering if there's some substance to it of we actually do need to think of our current historical moment instead of thinking constantly in the terms of 80 years ago.
Thank you. Please, Marco.
I have two questions very, very quickly. According to you, according your interpretation, is there a link between, during the Cold War, especially, is there a link between anti-fascism or anti-anti-fascism and anti-communism, certainly, and Atlantism? This is my first question. And another question is, according to you, what is the link between anti-fascism and anti-Berlusconism during the 90s? Thank you. Thank you for your lecture.
Please, Lorenzo.
Thank you. So, thank you so much for your lecture. You find a special moment in 1978 when the division for the special situation were suspended. I would like to know something about the problem that we are seeing also in this day. The Constitution. Is possible to find another special moment when the patriotism of Constitution seemed something that could change this division, and why for you this probably was not a success? Thank you.
Renato, please.
Thank you for the questions, sir. Very relevant. That would they would require much time to answer, but I will try to be telegraphic. Well, the problem of schools. This is one of the greatest problems of the country, I think. Starting with the numbers, our state is investing on education is at the lower level in the OECD countries. We are overcoming this negative list only by Bulgaria, without any negative reference to Bulgaria itself, but we have another industrial status. It was a problem during the story I told, and it is a problem still today. I think that one of the problems is the fact that teachers do not follow historical research. They were formed in the past. This is something very relevant also for teachers of history in particular. Remember, there was no class of education for history teachers in the school. They come from humanities, general studies, or for philosophy, from philosophy. Teacher with a real formation in history courses is limited in Italy still today. So I think there is a serious risk to having a teaching that is not updated to the research result. So what you said is strange, because what the last decades of research have given us about fascism is exactly the opposite. That is the totalitarian effort, the attempt of building new Italian, and so on. So absolutely no easy, no passive, but I think there is a second, probably, reason why of this limit. The first is in the education and preparation of the scene teachers. The second, I think, is in Italian society as such, and it's more general. Emilio Gentile has written abundantly about what he calls the banalization of fascism. Well, exactly this. In a society like the Italian one, which is banalizing fascism, why teachers not? I don't know if it's an answer to your question, but it's what it provoked in me. Genuine contrition. This is a very interesting topic. I know only one book I have read, which tries to begin a reflection on this, is Mauriuccio Salvati's book titled Passaggi, Passages, in which there is a chapter of the sense of guilt immediately after the war. According to his preliminary reconstruction, the idea is that Italy knew in the first years, after the end of the war, 1945, 1946, a debate on shared guilt for fascism, but that this immediately ended, was interrupted. So I think that researchers would be very welcome about this. There was a second point about overcoming fascism and anti-fascism or not. I have no ideological suggestion about this. I have the approach of an historian. George Mosse insisted, I think rightly insisted, on two parallel concepts. From one side, it's absolutely improbable that a new fascist phenomenon will come, because the conditions that defined fascism are not easily recurrent. At the same time, fascism is a symptom of the feebleness of mass democracy. So if probably fascism is ended, at the same time, fascism continuing to be a possible danger for democracy. In this sense, I think that studying fascism and studying anti-fascism continue to have value. This is not an answer, but a suggestion. As to Berlusconi's anti-fascism, Well, Berlusconi was exactly an anti-fascist leader. He read about Italian history. His culture came from Indro Montanelli's Italy, so history of Italy. He has not many, but significant declarations about the fascist past were exactly the child of that banalizing image of fascism we have just mentioned. Do you remember? This also about anti-fascism. Do you remember? Berlusconi once declared that the people who were sent to confinement in Italy, in the islands of the south, were unfortunate, and were fortunate people because in Mediterranean islands you could live, the sea, the sun. Of course, behind this kind of declaration there is reality. There's the difference between how Nazi Germany and fascist Italy treated the opposition. But they were in jail, where they were isolated, they were lived in absolutely, if not inhuman, but hard, very hard conditions. So this is banalizing. So I see Berlusconi exactly as the child of this stratified, long, anti-fascist culture that was so present in the Italian society even before. Constitution as an anti-fascist constitution and possible moments in which this appeal to a constitutional patriotism has worked. I think that it did never work. That is, the Constitution was anti-fascist. Was anti-fascist, but in a sense we have lost probably today. I am the nephew of one of the men who more clearly, more publicly spoke about the anti-fascist root of Italian Constitution. Aldo Moro, one of the speech he made at the Constituent Assembly at the end of the works, when he had to express the Christian democracy's approval of the Constitution, was in a part based exactly on this concept. Beware, this is not a post-fascist or a fascist constitution. This is an anti-fascist constitution. The reason is simple, because we needed a common house, and the common house we live comes on the basis of a common series of values that are anti-fascist. But this was not polemical. Absolutely not. This was simply the identification of the common values of the forces that had given birth to the Constitution. So I see a difference between this positive anti-fascism, if we may call this in this way, and every kind of negative polemical anti-fascism that has been the story that followed. So I know that it's not an answer, it's another suggestion coming out from the question.
Bene. I think we can close this very interesting morning and appointment. I just would like to thank again Renato Moro for the contribution he gave to us. Let me also thank the technician here of Sapienza who let us broadcasting the lecture everywhere or elsewhere, who knows. And also I would like to thank at the end the sponsor who let us organize that, Global Mosse Lecture Series, and i 3 dipartimenti della Sapienza, Scienze Politiche, il Dipartimento di Scienze Sociali e Economiche, il Dipartimento di Storia, Antropologia, Religione, Arte e Spettacoli. Grazie ai direttori, alle direttrici, al lavoro che è stato fatto, and we're going to have a light lunch. I think it's a good expression for all of us just here in the back. Grazie a tutti, buona giornata. Grazie Renato.